Hi, everybody. This is Adam Mellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It's April 27th, and I'm sitting down today to discuss this weekend's astrology. We're going to look at a few of the big transits taking place over the weekend. And then after we take a look at this weekend's astrology, we are going to consider the question, how do sun sign horoscopes work? It's a mystery to a lot of people. I get asked the question pretty regularly. For example, if I open up a newspaper or a magazine and they have a section that offers horoscopes for, say, the month of May, and those horoscopes are geared toward each of the 12 sun signs, how is it that those horoscopes work? How is it possible that they're accurate? Especially an important question for people once they get a little bit more interested in astrology and you realize the importance and depth and complexity of a birth chart. The natural question becomes, how could something based around just one sun sign generate any kind of, accurate results, or why would it be beneficial to look at such things when you could just focus on the birth chart instead? So we'll talk about that after we look at this weekend's astrology. So lots of stuff to talk about this weekend. A lot of sort of anticipatory stuff going on. We're just finishing the Mars-Pluto conjunction, which has been intense over the past, and it's been building for a couple of weeks, but it's been especially intense over the past week. Talk a little bit about that. I've already covered that over the past few days, so I'm not going to say as much about that today. We also have finally passed through the Mercury-Saturn square, so that's kind of coming to a close. Venus has just entered Gemini. Chiron has just entered Aries. So there's a lot of little things that have happened that are taking place. Probably one of the biggest things that's happening right now is the planet Uranus has just entered the 29th critical degree of Aries and is going to change signs to Taurus on May 15th. Now that's something I'll do a whole separate video about as well, the entrance of Uranus into Taurus. So today we're literally just going to talk about a few basic things to keep in mind for the weekend. Probably the biggest one being that I didn't mention yet, being the full moon. So the full moon will come through. Let's see here. My flowers just a little bit. About 1:30. No. Sorry, goofed up there. So it comes through Sunday evening in East Coast time. Full moon Sunday night going into Monday morning, but you can feel the full moon energy all weekend. Now, the full moon is taking place in Taurus and Scorpio. And one thing that this axis really features is the issues surrounding permanence and security in the world versus impermanence and insecurity in the world. So this full moon that we're going into across the Taurus Scorpio axis, for example, is highlighted in the life of the Buddha, who was said to be born under the full moon during Taurus season, which would make it a sun in Taurus and a moon in Scorpio, just like this full moon. Let's just refresh ourselves on some of the brief details of the story of Siddhartha. So we have a prince who's living in royalty and in an environment that's very lush, and all of his needs are taken care of and more. And at a certain point, he ventures outside of the palace and encounters death and poverty, and thus realizes the nature of the world sort of as it is. It's a place of impermanence and suffering. He then goes through the extremes of sensual pleasure, indulging himself as much as he wants, and also goes through the extreme of intense renunciation, to the point where he gives up everything, and becomes very, people basically starving themselves and basically renouncing the body and the material world as intensely as possible in order to achieve enlightenment. So he goes to both extremes, and then he finds the sort of golden middle. And the golden middle is, of course, something that Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad Gita, and that you'll hear Christians talking about sometimes with phrase. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said we are. I don't remember the exact phrase that he used anymore, but it's based on I believe it comes from Paul in the New Testament, where we're in this world, but we're not of it, and that's the basic sentiment. But you hear this kind of middle path talked about by mystics from all traditions, and the middle path involves not getting lost in the material world, but not cursing it either. So somehow in the middle, we have to search for spiritual enlightenment. The body is a vehicle. It's a temporary vehicle. We're not to get lost in the material. But we're also supposed to treat this body and this world like a temple, like a beautiful home that is housing us for the moment. So these tensions of extremes are very much highlighted across the Scorpio and Taurus axis. You have the fixed earth sign of Taurus in the springtime, and that seasonal archetype and the many of the behavioral things we talk about with Tauruses, a love of security, of simplicity, pleasure, sort of beauty. More or less, all of us are seeking for a beautiful, uplifting experience in the material world. Everything we do, you could say, is on some level motivated by the desire for happiness in the material sense. We want to feel okay in our bodies. We'd like health. We'd like happiness in our material bodies. So that's par for the course in the material world. We all seek that level of pleasure and comfort. Sometimes, however, it can go to an extreme, right, where we get identified with this temporary form that we're inhabiting, and we think, well, this is who I am. This is really what I am, and therefore we get fixated on things in the material sense that we think will make us happy: food, money, wealth, power, privilege, sexuality, etc. We get fixated on things that we think will bring us that enduring, stable, permanent, paradise existence. And obviously, the material world, after a while, if we pay attention, teaches us that this isn't possible, because whether it's the cycles of nature or the simple fact that you can observe your own actions in the world, what goes up must come down. You think that elegant dinner is really going to satisfy you, but hours afterward, you're hungry again. Or hours afterward, you've already forgotten what the food tasted like. You think that the marriage or the home or the family or the success or whatever is going to really fulfill you, but after a while, it feels empty. So whatever goes up must come down. And Taurus is sometimes under the illusion, a kind of sentimental Venetian illusion at worst, that everything's going to last forever, There's a famous article by an archetypal psychologist named James Hillman, who was a student of Carl Jung's. He wrote an article called, what was it? The imagination is bull, or something like that. So at any rate, he explores a lot of the American images in the article associated with the mythology of bulls in ancient times. And he associates the American mythology surrounding happiness and wealth and the 4th of July and American pies and the nicest neighbors and the white picket fence and the dream of the perfect politician, and all these kind of images that we see. Like if you ever saw the show Mad Men, which was a show that was on a while ago, it sort of projects that classic 1940s, 1950s image of success and American wealth. And you got the car and the kids and the wife and all this stuff, and cowboys and what I mean, the hero and all of this. And Taurus, though it's a very earthy sign, it's also a spring sign. It's also very youthful, and there's a kind of naivete about Taurus at times, that it takes the pleasures of the garden to be real and eternal, and when actually they're temporary and often illusory. So Taurus can fall prey to the romanticism of simplicity and beauty. And in that sense, Hillman jokes that sometimes there's a lot of BS in the bowl. And that's a funny way of thinking about it, because my wife's a double Taurus, I'm a Taurus rising, and when you're in Taurus land in your head, or you're projecting a Taurian fantasy, it feels very real. Yesterday, for example, was my wife's birthday, double Taurus. We went out for a long hike in the woods with my family, and then we took a walk down in Georgetown here in DC, and it's very beautiful down there. It's very idyllic and very wealthy and all this, and it's nice to walk by the water. But it has that feeling like this will last forever. This spring day has been like this the whole time. So we have to be very careful as we go into a weekend with a big full moon across the Taurus Scorpio axis, basically not to get lost in fantasies, projected images of success, happiness, wealth, etc., that can't in fact supply what we need. Now, Scorpio, on the opposite hand, in many ways is representative of the depth, darkness, death of autumn. It's a middle sign of autumn, so it's a deep dark sign. Mars's feminine abode compared to Venus's springtime feminine abode. So it's a sign that is much more in touch with the inevitable decline and death and deterioration of things in life. And so there's great wisdom in Scorpio. If you've ever been around Scorpios, my mother's a Scorpio. Scorpios oftentimes work in or are concerned with trauma and suffering. My mom's a nurse in critical care, and now she's a psychiatric nurse practitioner. There's no shying away from the difficult, the dark, the deteriorating, the shadow, the fear. Usually a much more of a willingness to look at those things, and a demand really for authenticity. No nicey, no fakey, no fakey phony with Scorpio, right? So that depth and darkness is the first noble truth of Buddhism, the realization of suffering and impermanence that has to happen for there to become a heart-centered, compassionate, and joy-filled spiritual existence. We can't have that kind of existence unless we have a real encounter with impermanence, and unless some of our delusions and ignorance about material things and our fantasies about happiness are sort of shattered a little bit. And that's difficult. Like that's painful. But that's where wisdom begins. So, there's a famous quote at the beginning of a famous text by a Jewish mystic astrologer named Ibn Ezra. He opens his book by saying, "The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God." And that statement sounds really awful to a lot of our ears, especially people who have had difficult encounters with religious figures. But what was really meant by that statement is that unless we recognize our helplessness as material creatures in the cycles of life, and that that we tend to be pulled along by them, and unless we admit that we are relatively powerless sometimes in that cycle, that it's very hard to fight against the urge to just cram tons of cookies down our mouths. That's just really hard. Like, no, I've never met, I've met some monks and very saintly people, who've worked on developing restraint of the desires to a very high level. But most of us, we live in a world where we're overtaken constantly by our desires. And so for Scorpio, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, is a real statement. It means you realize that you're sort of powerless, and you get off your high horse about how much control you have in life, because we all lose it eventually. We all deteriorate. Everything falls apart and dies. Scorpio ironically finds empowerment and wisdom in that reality, in that truth. So at any rate, you have that real wisdom. But here's the extreme that Scorpio can go to. Now, Scorpio can sort of, forget the sunshine, so it can go in the opposite direction. Sometimes we're so, as spiritual beings, we're so fixated on the impermanence. We're so fixated on the illusory nature of things pulling us along, shoving our heads under, and we get very defensive. We get very paranoid about what's real, what can be trusted. We get very intense, and we develop, on some level, we have to develop a certain kind of inherent pessimism about the promises of material life. But this pessimism, if it in and of itself becomes a new platform for our egos, then very quickly we, rather than the first noble truth empowering us to become compassionate, it becomes an excuse. It becomes a form of jaundice of the soul. It becomes a bitterness. It becomes a broody quality. It becomes even vindictive toward people who are authentically happy. Not falsely happy, but authentically happy. Scorpio can just think any kind of happiness must be false. So Scorpio can go to that extreme of darkness, and we don't want that either, right? So the Buddha, while he's sitting under a tree on the earth, this very nice Taurus scene, is confronted by all sorts of demons, and he has to face the temptations of the demons. Similarly, Jesus, when Jesus goes into the wilderness, crosses the Jordan after being baptized by John, and then he's out in the wilderness and he has a confrontation with Satan. And this is like this is really an archetypal moment along the path of spiritual enlightenment that many traditions talk about, where you're at some point, your renunciation, your level of renunciation will sort of be tested. That slice of pizza will appear, and you'll have to be like, nope, can't do that. But at the same time, you'll also be tempted at some point when your renunciation has advanced to a far enough level. You'll be at your a family member's home for dinner, and they'll be eating something that maybe is maybe it's a little sugary or something, and you'll be tempted to display some arrogance or vanity about how renounced you are, and then that'll become the temptation, right? So the temptations go back and forth. Sometimes we're tempted to renounce material things. Other times we're tempted we're tempted by material things and we have to renounce. And other times we're tempted by the spirit of renunciation as another way of building our sense of being more powerful than others. And so these are just some of the subtleties of the Taurus-Scorpio dynamic. But when a full moon in Scorpio comes through, this can play out in a variety of different ways. So, for example, it can come through about issues around money or lifestyle or diet or sex or relationships. And this could be a full moon where your partner's really happy and you're on that hobby horse of being like, well, there's something inauthentic about it, or they must be up to something, suspecting people that are close to you just because they're happy, and maybe authentically happy because they're taking care of themselves, they're doing okay. It's an easy time to get jealous. It's an easy time to get possessive. It's an easy time to lose ourselves in these extremes that we're talking about. So the full moon is, remember that the moon is a reflective light in the sky. And as a reflective light, the highest function of the moon, you might say, is the memory of higher things, because the moon is reflecting the light of the sun. And in the sort of traditional world of astrology, the sun is thought to be the organ of perception for the soul, the light of consciousness at its sort of highest alchemical level. That's what the sun is, and the moon is a reflection of that light. And so when a moon is full, there is an there's usually, in mundane sense, there's usually events and stories and themes that are kind of concressing and reaching some kind of climax. So that's normal. You see that happening. But it's when things are reaching a climax, when things are really full and bright and intense and everywhere, that we tend to forget. That's why people go mad under the full moon. That's a common myth, right? Why is that? Because people lose their minds. They lose their center. They forget. So one of the highest functions of our spiritual life during full moon time is remembrance. It's very easy to get wrapped up and lost in things during the full moon. So this is a full moon of remembrance, and it's one that pulls very strongly in contrary directions. Material security, no. Emotional depth and authenticity. How about a little brightness and happiness? How about not so much fakeness? These kinds of emotional dynamics can go back and forth. The middle ground comes when we remember. We remember these bodies are beautiful. We are here to inhabit beautiful temples and to create a sanctuary in the world. And it's meant to be beautiful and enjoyable and light and simple. On the other hand, the only way to build that is with a very cutting and real understanding about impermanence, suffering, and illusion, which are also around us constantly. So hold that tension through the weekend. That's the big important message from where I'm sitting anyway. So now, there's a bunch of other stuff going on. Mercury's just finished its square to Saturn. We've talked about that in some of the previous videos. Mars, Pluto, you can look back at my videos from earlier this week to really get into what that's been about. Uranus entering the last critical degree of Uranus is a very big deal because it's a critical degree. It's a culminating degree. The last degrees of all of the signs for ancient astrologers were, the very last were ruled by malefics. Either Mars or Saturn was thought to rule those, what are called terms. And that means that the last critical degrees of every sign are associated with culminating and cathartic events, but things that indicate confrontation, letting go, some degree of loss, etc. That's natural because when you think about it, when you leave a yoga studio, what is the very last pose that you do? Corpse pose. Death. Before you leave, you have to die. Same thing in shamanic ceremonies. When you're going through an ayahuasca ceremony, for example, or a sweat lodge ceremony, there is a sense in which before you can leave that place, something has to die. Some sacrifice has to be made. Same thing in divination. Ancient diviners, you didn't just cast a chart. There was ritual sacrifice involved. Now, we don't have to do that in terms of real animals and death. We've maybe evolved beyond needing to kill anything. But the image of death is very important. And as Uranus leaves a sign, it's asking us, clear, let go, let some kind of ending take place. It can be confrontational and difficult in that last degree. It can be combustible and it can be intense. But it's a lot easier when we have a glad heart, when we can study astrology and we say, wow, that's the 29th degree of a sign and something's leaving my life right now. Okay, cool. I'll just open my heart to that because I know that that's the natural intelligence of the cosmos. And how much cooler is it to be joyful about the fact that I'm a part of that than it is to stress about it, right? So at any rate, that's just my personal suggestion. It's easier said than done. It's easy for me to sit here and say, yeah, just go along with whatever Uranus might be trashing in your life right now. But that's the idea anyway. Hopefully we can do a little bit of surrendering. All right, Chiron has just entered Aries. That means it's switching signs and houses. For example, it's just entering my 12th whole sign house. And just as it's done so, I have felt the overwhelming desire to be a part of a ministry in prisons, giving yoga to people who are incarcerated. So I'm currently in the process of getting signed up to take a little of my spare time, which I don't have, but I'll find a way, and get into the lives of some people who are incarcerated and try to offer maybe some form of relief with yoga and meditation. I feel that very strongly, and I don't know why. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh right, because Chiron, the wounded healer, just entered my 12th house of prisons. So at any rate, check out where Aries is in your chart and just look and say, how is literally a sage, centaur, healer, master astrologer, how is this figure entering my life, either to address some of my own personal wounds or to inspire me to do healing work for the world, whatever the case might be. So look at the whole sign house of Aries and think about healing that's taking place in that area of your life. For example, if it was entering your third house, maybe you're going to start addressing some wounds or past traumas with your siblings. If it enters your fourth, maybe you're going to start addressing family karma. If it enters your fifth, maybe your kids are going to start doing some real healing. They're really going to start hitting some of their karmic, ripe periods. You get what I'm saying? So look at that too. So those are some of the big things. Venus has just entered Gemini recently. Is look at that area of your chart, see a little bit of a splash there. For example, Venus just entered my second house, which is a house of money and finances. And it's in a double-bodied sign, a mutable sign. Often that'll mean in the second house, you might be blessed with multiple different streams of revenue. Venus is like growth, things that grow in plant life. Enters your second house, you might see some money growing on the money trees, right? Not a lot for us astrologers, but at any rate, I've had a variety of interesting sales and things come into my life. I also had someone just donate a harmonium to me in the yoga studio. So it's interesting stuff like that, where you can just track where Venus is going, look at love, relationships, look at things of value or beauty. Be careful of what you're desiring, getting in touch with what you desire. Nice. Watch for the flow of your social interactions to change and become more dynamic and intellectual and sort of stimulating with Venus and Gemini. So there's some things to look for there. And that's just changed signs not long ago. So at any rate, that's what's going on right now for the weekend. So let's turn our attention now to talk about this question that I promised we would start with, which is, why do sun sign horoscopes work? How do they work, and why do they work? So if you don't know what they are, if you've ever opened a newspaper and been like, oh, let's go to the horoscopes, and then you see your sun sign, like, oh, I'm a Taurus, so I'll read my Taurus section, or hey, I'm a Sagittarius, let me read my paragraph on Sagittarius for the week or day or month or whatever it is. You might, as you get into astrology a little bit more, you're starting to say, how exactly does that work? Like what's going on there? Should it work? Is it fake? Is it real? How do they do it? And why does it work? Why should I pay any attention to that? Sometimes there's a little bit of an attitude that develops once we get into real astrology, right? That we start studying birth charts and we get into things like trines and sextiles and houses and aspects and all of this stuff that we see in the birth chart. We often say, well, there must not be anything to sun sign horoscopes because that has to represent something that's fundamentally less sophisticated because it only requires one planet, the sun. And I'm much more sophisticated than just one planet. I'm a whole birth chart. Well, let's try to be sympathetic to that position and first just recognize that yes, the birth chart will provide you with a level of sophistication and specificity that sun sign horoscopes can't because they're only using one planet. On some level, that's true. I would always say, if you're going to study something over a long period of time in astrology, you study your birth chart, make that the feature of your study, rather than, for example, just exclusively reading your sun sign horoscope column every month. Now, but that's actually not what I want to spend my time with today. I'm actually someone who writes sun sign horoscopes. I didn't used to, but I started doing them in the past year or two. And so I have a real, I want to advocate for them a little bit today, and I want to try to explain how they work. Let's talk about, first of all, how they work, because that'll make everything easier. So, okay, when you're reading that paragraph, or maybe that if you read like Susan Miller, who is a fantastic, very well-known writer of sun sign columns. She has her, what is it called? Astrology Zone, I think it's called. I can't remember. But it's, if you've ever read Susan Miller's, they're very detailed and, they're long, and every month she does it for every sign. So these are really accurate. And there's plenty of people out there who are doing sun sign horoscopes that aren't just like one little paragraph in a newspaper or whatever. So sun sign horoscope columns are written most of the time by very competent astrologers who know and have usually pretty sophisticated knowledge of the birth chart and all of the major theories and techniques of natal astrology. So it's just important to know that you're not dealing with hacks. You know what I mean? Because I think that sometimes the conception's like, okay, well, whoever's writing these, they must not be the real astrologers. You know, I really like Dimitri George, Stephen Forrest, whatever. I follow the real ones. You know, that attitude can develop within us, and it's problematic because sun sign horoscopes are fantastic and they really work. Here's how they work. Okay, let's say, for example, you're a Cancer. I'm a Cancer sun. You take the sun, you take the sun's sign. So I'm a Cancer, and every month at the beginning of the month, let's say it's May 1st, I use on my software program, I move my astrological clock, my chart, which I can manipulate through the software. I move it so that on May 1st, using whole sign houses, meaning each house is one whole sign. So the whole first house is Cancer. The whole, if you're an Aries, the whole first house is Aries, right? And then the whole second house would be Taurus, and so on around the wheel. Now, okay, so for my chart, I put Cancer on the ascendant, and that becomes the whole first sign house. And on May 1st, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through every day of the month, keeping the chart with Cancer on the ascendant, and then Gemini is my second house, and so forth, like that, all around. Oh, I'm sorry, that's actually backward. Let's see. I always get these backward. Hold on just a second. Let me just go back here to my. It's Leo. Leo's in my second house. Sorry. Okay, so it goes all the way around the wheel like that. And then what happens is I'm going to track the transits going through the whole sign houses throughout the month. And that's where I'm going to get my interpretations for each month. So, for example, if you're a Cancer rising, then Capricorn is your 7th house. So we just had a Mars-Pluto conjunction in the 7th house. And that was yesterday on the 26th of April. So if I was writing a sun sign horoscope for Cancers, all Cancers through the sun sign horoscope would be receiving a Mars-Pluto conjunction in their 7th house of marriage on the 26th of April. And it's like that. All transits that you look at for the month are going to happen in the whole sign houses of that chart. The chart always stays the same with Cancer on the ascendant, if you're a Cancer. Now, if I was doing it for Gemini, I'd put Gemini on the ascendant and then read all the transits for the month with a Gemini rising chart. And all of the planets are moving through all the whole sign houses with Gemini on the first. And then those transits in those houses tell me what's going to happen in what areas of life at what times. And the way that I'm orienting all of this is through the sun sign. So if you're a Gemini, I say, okay, well, if you're a Gemini sun, then here is your solar horoscope for the month. I'm reading what's called your solar birth chart, which means it's the chart according to the sun signs being placed as the first house in the day, week, or month, or year. I mean, you could do this as far out as you want. So that's how it works. That's how sun sign horoscopes work. And you have to check them out for yourself. It's very important that you read something more than just a sentence or two. The one thing I will say is that I don't like sun sign horoscopes that are like fortune cookies. They give you like a couple of generic sentences. Sun sign horoscopes that I really prefer are ones that are going to give you, at least 500 to 1,000 words, something like that. You get a couple of paragraphs breaking down the important days of the month, which planets are doing what at what times in your solar chart. Now, in my opinion, it works hands down. It's a very effective way of doing astrology. So it's especially good for people who don't necessarily know their birth information. It's especially good for people who are more or less lay people to astrology, and they are seeking guidance from the stars, but they don't know much more than their sun sign. And frankly, they either aren't ready for or aren't interested in going deeper with astrology. So we should be celebrating the fact that there is a form of astrology that allows the spiritual wisdom of astrology to enter people's lives with a much more sort of user-friendly interface. User-friendly meaning they don't have to think about things necessarily like trines or sextiles or charts or whatever. They just, okay, this is my sun sign. This is what's happening for me this month. In the very same way, you will find that far more people are not intimidated by tarot or by having their palm read or something like that, because it's very simple. The interface is very simple. Flip a card, it's got an image on it. I can see the image. It means something. Okay. I have dreams that show up and show me images that mean things. And so it's not too difficult for me to, I can sort of extend myself to the level of a card being flipped over. Oh, you can read something in my palm? That's great. Oh, there's a psychic who has skills and they can just tell me, oh, okay, that's great. Oh, but wait, you're telling me now that there's a science in the sky that's causing everything to happen by the planets, and it's this elaborate, no, thank you. That sounds too complicated, and I'm not sure I believe in that. Because people, you see what I'm saying? People are instantly repulsed by the idea of getting into a science. And then they also are, sort of repulsed by someone saying, actually, there's a whole like complicated calculus that, that I know, and I'll for $30 I'll tell you about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, people are like, nah, the calculus is, I know how complicated calculus is, and people aren't writing fortune cookies if they know about calculus. I'm pretty sure. You know what I mean? That's where people are coming from. That's their evaluation of the situation. And we have to really, as astrologers, it's very important that we don't look down our nose at people who are being reasonable. That's just reasonable. So when someone's being reasonable and yet they want to have an experience with astrology, sometimes astrology is a very accessible way for people to get into it. I have so many more people who contact me every month since I started writing sun sign horoscopes about their sun sign horoscopes than generally respond to my daily posts. And the reason for that is that they can send it to their mother-in-law. They can send it to their spouse. They can say, hey, you're a Taurus, read this. Hey, you're a Scorpio, read this. Do you see what I'm saying? So we should celebrate the fact that astrology has a valid and legitimate form of expressing itself that's very accessible to people. So I want to say that. For a very long time, there has always been a level at which astrology has been accessible and digestible to massive amounts of people, rather than the elite, esoteric intellectuals. And I say elite, in a way that's like, it takes a certain level of intellectual advancement in life to, or almost like, what do you call it? Literacy, to become interested in something as kind of complicated as the language of astrology, because you're getting into psychology and myth and symbol and metaphor. And I mean, it's dense stuff. It's not like a card that you just flip over, which, even though the tarot can be intensely complicated and intellectual and so forth, the entry point is still visual for people. And there's something that's more tangible and easy. Not everyone's oriented in a way to, grab astrology easily. So again, that's why I think it's very important. And for a long time, there has always been a level at which astrology has operated for the masses of people. And it should be preserved at that level. At that level, astrology is like a form of divination, meaning it should not be presented as, and it really doesn't operate as, a science, at least not in the way that we typically think about science. And we shouldn't be presented as though it is. For example, in the history of astrology, you have people who were, hold on just a second. Okay, fix something. Okay, you have you have people who are, basically, the high, sort of intellectual elites studying and practicing, and not necessarily even practicing for other people. It's more of a philosophically refined, almost like hermetic mystical study. Then you have practitioners who are operating at the level of working for kings and rulers and aristocratic families, and you have people who are more or less working then for the massive amounts of people reading everyday things like will you get pregnant, or how will your crops do, or whatever. So there's always operated at different levels like that. All right, so you also have the divinatory nature of astrology is also really old. So you don't you have people utilizing different birth times, for example. Like it's anything but scientific. You have people working with the time of conception. You have people working with the time of actual birth. You have sort of questionable practices around how birth was even timed a long time ago. Not only that, but you also have tons of examples where accidental charts that aren't cast for the right moment of something can still yield positive results. For example, this is not a joke. I have in my horary practice, I have accidentally entered the complete wrong time while doing a horary, and that horary still led me to the exact correct result for the individual. And I'm talking about doing things like finding missing objects. And that can happen because ultimately the thing that's speaking is spiritual and not just literal and sort of materially causal. You should, of course, always strive for a certain level of objectivity, but there's ultimately what we're dealing with here is an oracle. Ultimately, the medium through which the heavens speak is an apparently physical apparatus, but it's no different, for example, than if you're walking in the woods and an owl comes down and swoops down in front of you and sits on a branch. Oh my gosh, and the owl speaks. It says something. It alerts you right away. Oh my gosh, something's wrong, with my mother, right? And you just know. Well, did the owl that came down, was it physical? Yes. Is it empirically verifiable that an owl flew down and landed on a branch? Yes. Did the owl cause something to happen to your mom? No. Similarly, the heavens are like, they're omens. They're speaking as omens, and they're constantly communicating to us what's happening. But there's something greater than what we are able to easily comprehend is speaking through the apparently physical. So, Jung explored this when he explored synchronicities. A lot of people have talked about this, but it's very important because, again, the other thing that we can get up on a high horse about sometimes is we can say, well, the birth chart has an actual birth time, and it's a very sophisticated chart, and therefore it's the only thing that, I should really pay any attention to. So if we look at the history of astrology and we see how rooted in divination it is, then it's a very easy way of just remembering that there are multiple different forms of astrology that can express symbolic truth to us about what's happening in our lives. So, and they can do so very accurately. Sun sign horoscopes still utilize dates, transits. It's the same stuff that we're using for other forms of astrology. So I recommend that you check them out if you haven't yet. Let's see. There was one more thing I was going to say. Sometimes I write down my thoughts beforehand, and then I think to myself, no, I've got it all. I'll remember it, and then I forget. Let's see. So we talked about the divination, and we talked about it's been used by the masses. What else? Well, I can't remember for now, so I'll take questions if anybody has them. I have my own sun sign horoscopes that'll be coming out over the weekend. I write them now for Astrograph. If you haven't been to Astrograph, they do time passages software. Henry Seltzer, the owner, was just at Nightlight giving a talk on newly discovered planets. He's a really nice guy. It's been a real pleasure to write for them this year. So you can check that out there. And I always post those in my newsletter so you can read them like all month long and kind of look back and see what's been happening in your chart. Any questions from people? I see some back here that I missed. Okay, I'll go through them. Let's see. Susan, oh yes, thanks, Susan. Tipora, oh no, my Scorpio soul, you're pegging us. The light is so bright. Authenticity. How do you know? Some funny, right? Scorpios. Okay, let's see. It's very Scorpio moon in my 8th house natal chart, aligning with what my soul needs to do. This is so great to hear what you have to say. Oh, thanks, Susan. Chiron, no small player. Yes. Jennifer reminded me of that the other day we were talking. A few people actually have reminded me of that lately. I have Chiron on my ascendant. I'm not a big, I don't spend a lot of time tracking or paying attention to Chiron, but that's changing. Okay. Isabel says, I'm a Leo with Cancer rising. Cancer in the 1st house, Leo in the 2nd per whole sign house. So if I read the horoscope for Leo, it does not reflect my house sign planet config. So I always read the horoscope for my rising sign and not sun sign. I've been confused by this since I began studying. Yeah, you can always read your sun sign horoscopes, and someone writes sun sign horoscopes, your monthlies. You can read the sign for your sun, your moon, or your rising. I would really recommend, by the way, that if you were born during the daytime, that you read for the sun, and if you were born during the nighttime, that you read for the moon. In Hellenistic astrology, this is called your sect light. And oftentimes the sect light will have a bigger influence in your chart than the light that's opposite. So if you're born during the day, the moon is not necessarily as dominant. There's exceptions to this, and vice versa. So you can always pay attention to that as well. As your rising sign is also a big one. What is Chiron? Right. So Chiron is a little asteroid. If I hope the classification, I'm getting that right. It's one of the newly discovered planets that we track in astrology, and it's related to the archetype of the wounded healer. So it's both our wounds and the wisdom related to our wounds. Sun sign versus, we already answered that. What if you're born at dawn or dusk? Well, if you're born at dawn, it's more like daytime. If you're born at dusk, it's more like nighttime. So you generally go in that direction. That's a simple answer anyway. Just got the wristbands. Oh, good. Yeah. How's everybody's wristband challenge going? Let's see. Get mine out here. I was 8 days in, goofed up 2 or 3 days in a row, and now I'm back to my 3rd day without any criticism or being real harsh or something like that. So it's been pretty good. It's been coming along. My wife has now joined me. We've been promoting it at our yoga studio. I sent out over 100 of them, and I have a few more to go. We're just about out though. So we're also looking for, if anybody knows of a really good organic material that's just a little bit healthier for the planet than silicon, that would be great, because silicon, I don't know how you say it. That would be great. I know that there's different stuff out there. So if anyone finds a company that can make wristbands for us in the future that is, biodegradable or better, it's just a better product, let us know. Hate to do any damage while we're in the process of trying to help people. So there was one other thing that I really wanted to say about sun sign, and I'm just going to take it as I wasn't supposed to remember it. Something, and it's going to come to me, in like 15 minutes. I'm going to be like, oh, that was it. But at any rate, another question here. What happens when sun and moon are only 1 degree apart? Combust? Good question. So when that's like a new moon, right? So it's, you consider that a new moon. It's not really combust. You don't really think about the moon as combust in the same way that you do other planets, because the moon and sun have their own unique relationship. You think about it as the new moon, or the dark moon, or the just barely new moon, or whatever. If they're together, though, wherever they are, it's still either daytime or nighttime when you were born, right? So it's important to still take that into consideration. Wristband challenge is much tougher when tired and hungry. Yeah, totally. That sounds right to me as well. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you for tuning in. I hope that you have a little bit more love in your heart for sun sign horoscopes if you didn't before. Again, you can read for your sun, moon, or rising. Now you know a little bit of how they work, how they're done, why we should, pay attention to them, and hopefully you can, it's an easy way to share astrology with other people, to share a sun sign horoscope. So, all right, you guys have a very nice weekend, and we will see you on probably Monday. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.